Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the College of the Holy Cross. And as sponsor of the conference we're about to embark upon, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the college and to thank you for joining us. Margaret Friedge, who's the provost and dean of the college, had planned to be here herself to express her welcome, but unfortunately we have the death of a retired faculty member's son, and she has to be there for the wake and couldn't be there. So I get to welcome you on her behalf and on my behalf. It's an easy responsibility to have. I'm really excited about the work that we're embarking on here, and by the two events that are part of the conference, the exhibit in the Cantor Art Gallery and the concert by Gonzalo Grau and his combo that I'm looking forward to tomorrow night. Here in this room, Ream Library, we have in store a fascinating exchange of ideas on the concept of the Afropolitan and the ethics of Black Atlantic masculinities. Between now and Saturday, we and the students and faculty and visitors who will join us at different points will discuss texts and improvisations, slavery and its afterlives, consuming cultures, performing masculinities, and Afropolitan urban landscapes. The McFarland Center is really thrilled to be hosting such an impressive and multidisciplinary slate of scholars, and I look forward to the presentations and dialogue that ensue. Often when we sponsor conferences at the McFarland Center, it's my role to do the conceptual and intellectual work. Fortunately for me, and for you I think too, for this event, two of my great colleagues, I get to stand as a bystander, and two of my great colleagues, Professors Rosa Carrasquillo and Laurel Semley, really conceived and framed this work, and I owe them a great debt. I'm grateful to them for their vision, their scholarship, and the follow-through on putting it together. I also want to thank some colleagues at the college who will serve as discussants for each panel. Michael West from the History Department, Selena Gallo-Cruz from Sociology and Anthropology, Jean Adriago from French, Alvaro Harin from Anthropology, and Melissa Wiener in Sociology. I'm especially grateful to Pat Hinchliff. Those of you who got here know that Pat did a lot of that work, so for adeptly handling the logistics, travel, and the like, and meals. And Danielle Kane, who coordinates our publicity, and I always say makes me look a little bit good. So I also want to thank the AV services and conference services teams, who sometimes get left out of our thanks, but help things run smoothly. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Ream family. They're the ones who gave us this great room, the Reams. But they also gave us the funding to sponsor conferences like this, and we're here because of that, and we have a debt to them. Their generosity does remind me of one small but important matter, which is to say we just redid the room this year after 15 years, which means I have to ask people not to bring in any coffee or food in here. All the worst damage that we ever have is conferences when people leave things on the floor and forget about them. So, in conjunction with the conferences I mentioned, we are excited to present a photography exhibition and a concert. After the talk tonight, we'll invite you to join us in the Cantor Art Gallery downstairs for a reception celebrating the art of Hector Mediavilla, whose work is really fabulous. And he's exhibiting photographs from the series SAPE, Société des Ambianceurs et des Personnes Élégantes, as well as recent photographs from Christopher Lopez from Puerto Rico, titled A Visual Guide to the Heart, the Music of Ismael Rivera. They're both vibrant, wonderful things. It thrilled me to be in the gallery last night and to see that work. And that work will be on view till December 12th. Also tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, the college's Arts Transcending Borders initiative will treat us to a concert featuring Gonzalo Grau and the Mayela Tribute Combo in a tribute to Ismael Rivera, an Afro-Caribbean icon in the Hogan Ballroom. So I think most of you will get to go, and that should be great. I'm looking forward to it. But that's enough from me. I'm looking forward to getting started and to hearing more about our first keynote speaker, Silvio Torres-Saillant. But Rosa Carrasquillo, Professor Carrasquillo, is going to introduce us. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. And it is an honor y un gozo to introduce to you Professor Silvio Torres-Saillant. From the very first time that we were brainstorming about this conference, Professor Torres-Saillant was my #1 choice for a keynote speaker. Although this is the first time that we actually meet in person, I feel like so many other Caribbeans that he is my teacher. Indeed, his work in Spanish and in English have shaped all of us who study the Caribbean. He has written, in my opinion, one of the best intellectual history of the region. And his open challenge to Dominican intellectuals and the state are inspirational, not only for its content, but also for its style, where he employs popular culture as a tool to dissect the ruling class professed anti-Haitianism and general anti-Black sentiments. But beyond my personal admiration, Professor Torres-Saillant has gained a well-deserved reputation and recognition for his innovative and excellent research and teaching methods. He is a professor in the English department at Syracuse University. He co-founded La Casita Cultural Center, an organization that works to create bridges of collaboration and exchange, linking Syracuse University with the Latino population of the city. He serves in the core team of DK, Democratizing Knowledge, an initiative that promotes strategies for decolonizing the academy. Professor Torres-Saillant research and teaching interests revolve around some central concern pertaining to the enduring legacy of the colonial transaction spearheaded by the Christian West starting over 5 centuries ago. They have to do with the relations of power that made bodies of knowledge unequal across regions, languages, and cultures of the world. They respond to the continuing monopoly that the Christian West holds over the authority to define the human being. As such, his research and teaching projects touch on race, ethnicity, intellectual history, imperial violence, the problem of culture and civilization, diaspora, migration, the tension between the ethnic and the human, and the necessity to interrupt the logic of maltreatment that informs the corporate capitalist system spawned by colonialism. So please join me in welcoming Professor Torres-Saillant.
Thank you, Professor Carrasquillo, for that wonderful introduction. I am very glad to be here. It is the first time I visit this campus, and I'm liking it already. Would not disdain a job offer. But don't let my dean know that I said that. I am very grateful to Professor Carrasquillo and to Professor Laurel Assembly for the tremendous work that has gone into bringing us all together from different corners of the globe, including a colleague coming from all the way from Vienna. Is that correct? Yes? I'm also glad that I am saying my words at the McFarland Center, because as you'll see when I get to the core of my talk, I'll have something to say about the role of Christian piety in the mess that we're in historically, and the failure thereof. Right? Very grateful to. Well, I'm glad that I'm the first person to speak, because that means I will not have to stress for the rest of the conference, and I'll be able to learn to enjoy the presentations by the other colleagues who've come from near and far. So I have to do something, right? I have to do something, right? I have to press. I like to begin with an image. And I like to begin by saying that my first introduction to Africa and to Africans came through the comics that I read from the Tarzan franchise. Yeah? And they were peculiar comics because you had a young child who ended up in Africa through an accident with a family. And then he somehow has the ability, as he grows up, to learn the language of the apes and everything, and become friends with the most strategic beasts. And then he becomes the master of the jungle. He becomes the man in the jungle. But somehow the people who have been there like for centuries somehow did not manage to attain this similar degree of proficiency to deal with the beasts and so on and so forth. So that was the thing. But that at the time seemed normal to me on the basis of the education that I had been received, or that I saw nothing shocking there, because the ambient learning that I was receiving from people in the neighborhood, from people everywhere, but also from the textbooks, was that Africa was the place where history happened when visitors made it, And the mass of the invisible mass was just a factor that emerged or disappeared, as needed by the players, who were always from elsewhere, And then there was one way that I learned. I began learning a different kind of Africa only with my contact with the cultural programs of Casa de las Americas, which actually, Casa de las Americas in Cuba, which actually made it a point to teach about, to allow the Forum of Casa de las Americas to become a venue for disseminating information about the human experience in Africa, and Africans as historical beings and as human beings, as normal human beings who had struggles and all of that. So this was my first introduction, and because at the stage where I was educated primarily by this, as replicated by the early ordinary contact with my surroundings, I could not possibly have imagined this also as somehow connected with Africa. This is none other than Alessandro de' Medici, who is, as you may recall, the first Duke of Florence, and he is also the first husband, the husband of Charles V's daughter. There was something in that world that somehow did not make it so weird. At that moment in history, the 16th century, was possible for this guy with these features to somehow attain that degree of ascendancy. But I did not have access to that. I did have access to the education that I received from my own country, where, as you know, I was born in an island which is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Elizabeth Manley, who is a worker in that field in Haitian-Dominican relations, can attest to that. I was educated by a discourse that, in its most extreme form, said by white supremacists, right? White supremacists who need not be white, who contended that part of the country's underdevelopment had to do with its progressive Africanization due to its proximity to Haiti and Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic, and that we had to resolve that. So that's what I was, and so in that context, I thought nothing of this performance by Wilfrido Vargas in a merengue which he borrowed from Colombian performers, but the Colombian performance did not have this feature that you're going to see now, and I thought nothing of it. And if you look at the phenotype of the performers, the punchline is that the title of this merengue is El Africano, which was the original title coming from Colombia. And so they have to find a way to represent El Africano in the performance. I think if I just press the arrow, right? Will that go? And you're supposed to go like this. Now all the kids at home are watching this, yeah? And they're accepting this, this representation because any one of them, of the performers, could perfectly well qualify to appear as representing El Africano. But they don't see it that way because the El Africano is from somewhere and is a place with some distinct characteristics that have you know, striking difference from what we as a civilization are, right? Notice that African, by the time I came around, African was no longer just a descriptive adjective, yeah? It was also a qualifying adjective. Example of that, I found it odd when I read Emperor Jones, that famous play by Eugene O'Neill from 1920s, which deals with this you know, Pullman Porter man who has a criminal record, and he manages to escape, goes to an island which is thinly disguised as to represent Haiti, and then he becomes the emperor there, yeah, and all of that. But not the plot, but I was intrigued by the stage directions, in which O'Neill seems to be giving clues to the directors and producers of this play, and he describes Emperor Jones as a black man of the extreme African type. Yeah? How do you do that? You know, how do you choose the actor so that the man actually represents the features of an extreme African features, yeah? So there is much there that I'm not going to sort of belabor on in terms of overall preface. I'm going to say my words that I prepared for you with the understanding that what I'm saying is largely connected to the urge that leads to the production of this apparent project or agenda or movement called the Afropolitan. Yeah? So, first, I would like to share with you some of the thinking I've been doing over the past few years concerning our legacy of antipathy across differences of phenotype and ancestry. At one point in my reflections about social relations, I began to wonder about the amount of time that our civilization spends obsessing about people's origins, skin hues, and facial features. I have been increasingly drawn to the exploration of a question that I ended up formulating by drawing from the discursive demeanor of a dear friend who has a very distinct way of using words. When she finds something particularly appalling, overstepping the bounds even of indecency, she sums up her indictment by exclaiming, "That's not normal." End of quote. I ask then, how normal is it for members of a species that prides itself in its presumed capacity for discernment, its development of language, its cultivation of the arts and sciences, and the ingenuity that has enabled it to rule over the other species within the zoological sphere to become so deeply engaged and with such devastating consequences in forging dogmas bent on stigmatizing difference. The species that views itself as closest to the gods has squandered an incalculable portion of its mental endowments in speculating, pontificating, legislating, and implementing actions based on ironclad paradigms concerning the differentiated value of humans depending on the varying appearance of their bodies, and it has done so at the risk of endangering its own survival. As a student of antiquity, I have tackled the question of how normal this proclivity is by looking to see if humans have always exhibited this deranged behavior. And I'm now convinced that no, it is not normal. The fact that it has become normalized over the last 4 centuries does not make it normal if seen from in the framework of a long view of history going back 4 millennia, for instance. I'm interested in questions of the kind that seem to draw from the ideologically unencumbered state of wonder that we experience in early childhood. I am seduced by the question posed by African-American jazz musician Darrell Davis, who, on the side, does anti-racist work by seeking the acquaintance and sometimes the friendship of Ku Klux Klan members, whom he approaches with the question, how can you hate me if you don't know me? And by the way, he has in his gallery some 50 hoods that he has collected from people who have delinked from the association after he gets them to have a conversation, about this, There's a film that you might want to look at, what sort of outlines his career. Is called Accidental Neighbors. No, I'm sorry, Accidental Courtesy. Accidental Courtesy. I imagine myself asking a similarly innocent question of enduring white supremacists, namely this: if you truly thought you were superior, why would you guys have to repeat it constantly to yourselves and to others for so many centuries? Isn't that a legitimate question, at least from the perspective of a child, right? These meditations are now shaping up as a book manuscript, which I have tentatively entitled Racial Selfhoods, Western Identity and the Fracture of the Human, which I take the liberty of describing mostly because Professors Carrasquillo and Sempli, in their call for papers, announced that I would be drawing from my latest research. I don't know if you remember, but you did that. So it is a 5-chapter monograph that compares antiquity and modernity with a focus on conquest, subjection, and enslavement to understand why ancient oppression of foreign others did not yield discourses of disparagement meant to reduce the humanity of vanquished or captive peoples. The conquest and colonization of the Americas started a historical momentum whereby a few Christian nations of Western Europe, armed with guns, germs, and steel, would succeed within a couple of centuries at imposing their dominion over the lives of peoples throughout large portions of the globe. In this modern era of the history of domination, however, the outpouring of acrimonious sentiment voiced by the victors about the physical, intellectual, spiritual, social, and moral conditions of the subjugated populations would become an intense growth industry that would continue unabated until the 20th century. As a result, we can confidently speak of the intelligentsia of the Christian West, from Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda in the 15th century to 16th century, through Lothrop Stoddard, as engaged in a 4-century-long public relations campaign of detraction comparable to what 21st century social media users refer to as trolling. The amount of thought, writing, and preaching on the inferiority of captive populations, the amount of effort spent on casting aspersion on those who were already underfoot, and the insistence on humiliating and dehumanizing those living in servitude has no precedent in ancient chapters of the history of domination. Nothing of the kind shows up in a look at domination throughout the 3,500 years prior to 1492, from the heyday of the Babylonian king Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, to the rule of Nubian king Shabako, to the regime of Alexander of Macedon, to the dominance of Caius Julius Caesar of Rome, to the vast territorial encroachment of the Chinese emperor Kublai Khan. We find ancient conquerors devoid of the compulsion to diminish those under them. They had already been diminished by the very act of domination. So the additional side seems odd. But we would certainly find a poet or a chronicler documenting or extolling the exploits of a victorious monarch in those millennia. But we will not find the literati, the clergy, scholars, and statesmen consumed in the ongoing task of proclaiming the lesser humanity of the peoples whose lands, labor, and liberty they had taken. The fervor shown by the learned elites of the West in affirming their ontological superiority over the vanquished, the enslaved, and the dispossessed would most likely have confused ancient masters. Drawing on my early classical training and my advanced studies of European literature and thought, as well as my continued engagement with history and intellectual traditions, in Racial Selfhoods, I seek to shed light historically on the circumstances that caused the scholars, thinkers, philosophers, theologians, and literary artists from the 16th century onward to unsheath their pens to devise moral rationales for the work of conquest, subjection, and enslavement effectuated by their monarchs abroad. I explore the moral scenario that drove them to endeavor to show their rulers not just as mighty, which would have sufficed in antiquity, but also as pious, even in light of the suffering, despair, desolation, and destitution wrought by their incursions into other people's lands. I advance the hypothesis that to sustain the piety of their Christian nations, especially once it became unthinkable to walk away from an economy of conquest and colonization that had opened unprecedented and until then unimaginable possibilities for wealth, power, and prestige, they chanced upon the discursive strategy of rendering the subjugated populations deserving of their undoing. And I should add that they were unprepared for this jackpot that fell into their lap, because there was no way they could possibly have imagined that by financing the trip by Columbus, that all of this would become available. Yeah? So they were not prepared psychologically. You know, what to do if we become all of a sudden So the discourse of justification of the reduction of entire populations to mere labor power to fuel colonial economies found ways of turning Christian projects of domination into a sort of cultural mentoring that came to be known as civilizing mission. Invaders thus came from Europe armed to the teeth to elevate the humanity of lesser peoples in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The discourse of justification created a logic whereby the conquered, in fact, needed the conqueror to enhance their human caliber, correct the error of their ways, acquire the only true religion, learn to govern themselves, overcome their own irrational beings, compensate for their lesser intellect, value the wealth that the Almighty had undeservedly put within their reach, and refashion themselves in the image of their masters. To argue that in depriving foreign peoples of their possessions and their liberty, Christian conquerors from Europe were actually rendering a charitable, cultural, moral, intellectual, and spiritual service to their vanquished, the discourse of justification had to steer rapidly and radically away from the first impression recorded by Columbus in his diary, in his diary of the first voyage, which had represented the natives, the first time he encountered them in the Caribbean, the Taínos, as peaceful, noble, beautiful, and kind. Yeah? That has to be withdrawn very quickly, not long thereafter. Yeah? If the conquered natives remained good people, worthy of admiration, the piety of the conquering Christians would simply fall flat on its face. The disparaging them, even to the point of construing their humanity as defective, seemed the best way of dulcifying an economy led by Christians that involved the systematic maltreatment of people who had not provoked the violent invaders from Europe. The disparagement of the ancestral and often phenotypical other begat the dogma that became known as racism, which came after. It was not prompted. Conquest was not prompted by it. Right? It was the product. Yeah. Racial selfhood contends that the dehumanization of the downtrodden, in response to a need of the learned to safeguard Christian piety in the morally untenable context of the cruel and abusive colonial economy, begat the racist dogma. I posit that racism emerged as an unintended consequence of human beings wishing to think of themselves as good, even while greed drove them to harbor ambitions whose fulfillment could not come without committing unspeakable acts of wrongdoing. Stressing historical conjunctures and foregrounding the role of the learned elites, racial selfhood seeks to shed light on racism by focusing not on the present social pathology that disturbs our tranquility when it appears before us in the news or in the workplace, but on its place as a historical phenomenon with its genesis, chronologies, evolutions, and shape-shifting transmutations. The study locates race as a fundamental concern of scholars, artists, and thinkers that stands out in intellectual history over the last 400 years. I challenge the claim that the shock of difference somehow produced antipathy across phenotypical or ancestral difference, be it the aversion of Spaniards upon setting eyes on insufficiently clad natives in the Indies beginning in 1492, or as Winthrop Jordan would claim, the cultural challenge faced by the English when encountering the stark, unfamiliar dark-skinned hue in the body of West African decades later. Such claims fail to acknowledge the easily demonstrable fact that people in antiquity had nothing barring them from coming upon difference of phenotype or ancestry. Herodotus, for instance, describes phenotypical difference when he finds it in Ethiopia, in India, or Egypt, with the attention that difference deserves, but never with a sense of shock, suggesting that he did not expect it to exist. Suffice it to remember that ancient Alexandria was the original melting pot par excellence, if ever there was one. I basically devote the study to an exploration of the innocent question, how did we become racial beings? The humanity we discern from the literary archive of Greek and Roman antiquity appears free of racialization, even when individuals of different phenotypes dislike one another. The conflict or antipathy we find does not appear automatically to extend conceptually to the whole ethnos that the one or the other antagonist represents. In the Trojan War, as evoked in the poems of Homer and Virgil, the death of Ethiopian king Memnon, who has come from Africa with his warriors to the aid of King Priam amidst his end at the hands of the ferocious Achilles, elicits no less compassion, no less pathos than that of Achilles' beloved companion Patroclus, who has come to Troy among the Myrmidon forces. I am interested in the intellectual history of race. I distinguish my inquiry from those rooted in the history of ideas. You know, one idea meeting with another idea, like one book going to bed with another, and another book in procreating a third book. You know, and so somehow suggested that sort of thing. Yeah. So I distinguish my inquiry from those rooted in the history of ideas, the sort that would accord much value, for instance, to a passage in the Politics of Aristotle that refers to natural slaves, to identify there an idea that might suggest or even beget the ideology that would later fuel racism with its biological disqualifications of populations. The idea of natural slave would indeed become central to the racist dogma and would inform the study of natural science as well as the study of society in more recent times, in times closer to us. However, scholars who grant primacy to Aristotle's opinion in their genealogies of racism seem undisturbed by this not so negligible detail. In antiquity, nobody seems to have cared about the fact that the philosopher from Stagira had expressed such a view in one of his numerous works. The pertinent passage from the Politics of Aristotle does not seem to come up in the jurisprudence regulating the practice of slavery in ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mali, or medieval Europe for some 2,000 years after he wrote it. Yeah? One would have to wait until the 1540s, when the Spanish philosopher and theologian Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a Dominican priest, not Dominican from my ancestral homeland, we have our own problems. A Dominican priest who had excelled as a student and translator of the works of Aristotle, yeah, so he had a special interest in Aristotle, having produced himself a Latin version of the Politics, where that passage is to be found. And he infused the aforementioned Aristotelian passage with moral, religious, and political valence that he had never had before. Yeah? As official chronicler of the Spanish crown and advisor to Emperor Charles V, Sepúlveda realized the value of dusting off an obscure claim by Aristotle concerning people fitted by nature to servitude. It served him as a conceptual resource of which he could avail himself in the discursive task of ennobling the wholly unchristian economy of conquest and colonization pursued by the ruler who employed him. Yeah? I would argue it's a professional decision. Therefore, we owe the notion of the slave by nature to Sepúlveda's plight as an intellectual who, in Spain, 2,000 years after Aristotle, found himself in need of responding to the reality that history and personal circumstances had put him in. That's how I understand intellectual history, as opposed to ideas running, doing their own thing. I choose intellectual history for my framework as a useful paradigm that enables us to investigate the extent to which historical events, often unforeseen, largely determine the things that intellectuals will say about humanity and the world. Racial Selfhoods tells the story of how, with intellectuals at the helm, race came to fracture social relations across phenotype and ancestry, while I sustain that an understanding of that history offers us the necessary clues for imagining realistically the steps we will need to take to unlearn the fracturing pedagogy of the racist dogma. The study closes with a meditation on the possibility of a reverse training that could help us restore our view of humanity to its condition prior to the fracturing induced by the imperatives of colonial domination. I pursue the inquiry outlined here by considering texts from the Hammurabi Code, 2,250 years before Christ, to the Confessions of St. Augustine, to the etymologies of St. Isidore of Seville, in order to recover the memory of a time when servitude said absolutely nothing about the human caliber of the person in bondage. I then examine texts from Hebrew antiquity to Herodotus, to the Vinland Saga, to Marco Polo's travels, which attest to the long history during which encounters with difference of phenotype and ancestry occurred without racialization. Even after the colonial transaction had begun, we can draw on texts from European literature, scholarship, painting, religion, and politics from 1492 through the mid-17th century to see over 150 years during which Christian subjection of foreign others already on its way, the disparagement of difference was still a new pedagogy that had not yet sunk in. As a result, individuals of African and other origins in Europe could attain levels of ascendancy that would become bizarre a century later. Yeah, and you've seen the example of Alessandro. Alessandro's father has him with a slave woman in the household, and yes, he has those features, but that's his son. He's going to fight for him to inherit the title and so on and so forth. Yeah, that differs radically from what happens a little bit a century and a half later, when Mr. Jefferson is not even able to acknowledge that he has produced those kids, he has sired those kids by Sally Hemings, or even to grant them freedom. Yeah? So there's a history here, right? There's a historical phenomenon, right? So the African-born, as a result of that ambiguity of that 150 years, yeah, the African-born crusader, an African-born crusader could earn beatification and canonization, going on to become Saint Maurice in Germany. Yeah, Africans could come to Europe as slaves and could become lieutenants of conquistadors, participating in the pillage of the Americas, just like any other bad guy. Yeah, and at the end of the service, receive their freedom and land and property as recompense. Yeah, as the case of Juan Garrido illustrates. Juan Garrido, who invaded Puerto Rico and subsequently Florida among the soldiers of Juan Ponce de Leon. Juan Latino, again an Afro-Spanish guy who came first as an enslaved man, could become the author of a major epic in Latin in praise of the Austria family, of the Austria regime, Juan de Austria and company, yeah? And joined the faculty of the University of Granada, which was his day job. Just as Juan de Pareja could have a life as a painter working in the atelier of the renowned Francisco Velázquez. Nor would the Negroid features of Alessandro, as you heard here, prevent him from becoming the first Duke of Florence and husband to the daughter of Emperor Charles V. I also look at intellectual, religious, and literary positions from Sepulveda to Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, vis-a-vis contemporaneously dissenting voices from Anton de Montesinos to Abbé Grégoire to Count Volney, and even some honest French administrators of colonial slavery, to document the fact that to document the contestation faced by racist constructions from the very beginning. The battle over the definition of humanity reveals the extent to which the architects of the fundamentalism of ancestry and phenotype found themselves existentially trapped within circumstances that made their racist dogma an implement of their material and psychological exigencies. Especially in the 18th century, the discourse of dehumanization of foreign others under Christian control attains maturity as a normative status that would leave very little room for cases of such as those of Alessandro to repeat themselves. In the 18th century, blackness had emerged in the Americas as a debased identity. And if I don't get to say it, it is this construction of this blackness, yeah, that travels back to Africa, yeah. The aggression is not initiated with Africa. It is basically these people who are debased need to have a debased origin, as it works backwards, yeah. But I'm open to refutation of that, and I'm ready to fight. In the 18th, okay, so a debased identity, a construct of the economy of maltreatment and dehumanization that the colonial economy required. Yeah? By then, Jefferson, as you know, could not afford this, and Coleridge, whom we love as a poet, yeah, would argue himself into apoplexy, yeah, in the effort to demonstrate that William Shakespeare was too brilliant a poet and playwright to conceive of his noble character Othello as actually being a quote-unquote veritable Negro. Yeah? Even despite all of the textual evidence to the contrary, yeah, in the text, as you recall, who remember having read it. But still, there were American and European intellectual acquaintances of Jefferson who parted ways with his virulent Negrophobia, just as in Coleridge's own England, during his own generation, a cadre of Afro-British writers had emerged, and the likes of Dr. Johnson befriended them without apparent prejudice. One might remember Julius Sobies, an 18th century Afro-Brit who led a wanton life, breaking his share of white English women's hearts and earning the rebuke of his own co-ethnic Ignacio Sancho, who charged them with harming the images of the black population in England with his roguish ways. Finally, racial selfhood closes by attending to historic and culturally wide-ranging documents from antiquity to the present in search of instances that show the survival of a discourse that never ceased to cling to a holistic and diverse view of humanity. The texts considered here go from the Antigone of Sophocles to the Hippocratic Oath, where the physician commits to do his best with the patient, irrespective of any kind of origin or social marker. Yeah? Hillel the Elder's Golden Rule, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of humankind, the 1511 anti-colonialist sermon by Montesinos, going all the way to Walt Whitman's poem, I Sing the Body Electric. Go back and read it now with Racing Mind, sections 7 and 8. The speeches of the civil rights leader, Reverend Martin Luther King, who spoke about this web, right? This web of humanity, yeah? And the work of Darrell Davis, whom I have mentioned, and the various truth and reconciliation projects still active throughout the Americas. The study of it all looks to the past to imagine the future, recovering the uninterrupted existence of a discourse that held on to anti-racist yearnings, even in the most rabidly racist times. Racist thought has coexisted with a less powerful but enduring body of discourse from the very start of the colonial transaction in Santo Domingo to the inter-ethnic effort that brought about the social gains of the civil rights movement in the United States during the 1960s and continuing on today. Thank you very much. How did I do in... Yeah?
I have some questions actually. Sorry, I know it. But you talked about one very important point because I never thought about this. I study modernity and I know that something changed, and you think that what changed was jurisprudence.
No, I'm saying what changed you.
Jurisprudence is what changed the racialized ontology.
No, what changed was the need to justify it. Because for Kubla Khan, if you went to Kubla Khan and you said, but look what you're doing to those guys, he would have responded, but what do you want me to do? I need to extend my holdings. So it's the moral burden. It's the moral burden of not being able to do bad things to other people. Whereas Kubla Khan would have accepted that would have accepted the responsibility of his wrongdoing, and he was doing it for the sake of advancing his holdings, because the morality that Christianity, remember, Christians are people who have had this very privileged situation. Christ has actually died, right? Died to cleanse them of their sins, yeah? And so now being Christian is being good. And I can tell you because in Washington Heights, I used to pass, on my walk to City College, I used to pass a sign in which a woman who made herself available for childcare, and she would say, "Señora Cristiana cuida niños." Yeah? So she did not need to say, "Well qualified señora." There was something inherent in that. And that's what a Christian carries. You know? And so antiquity did not need to say that I'm helping them become better people. It was okay to say, I need more land and more people serving me. So, for instance, what's this? Oh, please, age, don't listen to me. What is this? It's not a Greek historian who wrote parallel lives. He would compare. He was writing during the Roman period, and he would compare a Greek figure compared with a Roman figure, and he would do those things. The name will come. It's Plutarch. Yeah. See, my memory is better than yours, and I'm this old, so I'm not doing so bad. Okay. So Plutarch gives us in the portrait of Alexander. He tells us about this attack that Alexander had planned against the Persians because he was interested in having all that huge empire that the Persians had, right? And so there was this battle, which Alexander won, but it was not a definitive battle. So Alexander retires to his camp, and then you've been in wars of pillage. As you know, at the end of the battle, then people come in and they count, how many we captured, what were the actual goods that were left behind, and what's the booty? What's the booty, right? And so they come to Alexander's tent and say, we have a problem. Yes, we have these women there. One is Darius' mother. Darius, the Persian king. One is Darius' mother. Then you have a sister and a daughter, and they are crying inconsolably because they think that Darius has died. And he goes, oh no, please. And also he sent an emissary, right? Please tell them that Darius escaped safe and sound, yeah? And also please tell them that my only reason for making war against him is for domination. Yeah? Now, that ability to say that disappears when it is the turn of the Christians to be at the forefront of domination. Yeah?
But so my question was, what do you do with the 15th century Portuguese slave trade and also with the relationship with the Afro-descendants to the Muslim faith that sort of kind of validated that slave by nature according to Sepulveda?
Well, remember this, and this is very important, and this is central. I'm glad you asked that question. And please, if I don't answer it directly enough, come back to me. Important for this conference, for the Afropolitan, right? The reason we are in dire need of rehabilitating the humanity, right? The image of the humanity of people of African descent, yeah, and of Africa, yeah. But the stuff did not begin with people of African descent. It began with the indigenous population of the Americas. Yeah? That is where the articulation of inferiority was articulated so intensely and so profoundly. The rest is borrowings. In fact, if you read Sepulveda, I did a partial translation of the Democrates Secundus, which is a treatise on why the war against the indigenous people is a just war. Yeah? It's a just war, right? And I have translated some portions, if I can find them and read some passages. There's nothing in 19th century U.S. Southern extreme Negrophobia that surpasses anything that Sepulveda is saying about the Indians in Mexico and the Caribbean and so on and so forth. Yeah? Racism, became so. And also remember when we get to the when the first Africans, enslaved Africans, come to Virginia, 1619, right? What are they called? They're called Negroes. Why would Anglophone people use that word? Yeah? It's a Spanish word, right? It's Negros mispronounced. Right? Which means that there was already a century of knowledge, a century of colonial knowledge produced on the plantation. Yeah? But before what happens is there was during the colonial period, yeah? The conquest and colonization began with the indigenous population, yeah? That was the first population that needed to be inferiorized, yeah, and dehumanized. Once you have a discourse available, then you can simply transport it to the next population that is going to be needed, because, for instance, in the Caribbean, the population was the labor. This abundant labor force that they found was severely depleted as a result of, diseases and all of that, and overexploitation that the natives were not prepared for. There's a historian who claims that the tropical origins of Africans did enable them to survive the maltreatment in the Americas, and so they became the favorite. Yeah. One of the things that my study does is it tries to naturalize slavery. Yeah, because we tend to think of slavery as something that began with modern slavery, but you need to know that slavery was probably the thing that most people were in risk of undergoing if they did not have resources. Yeah, or even if they had resources but they fought in a war and lost. Yeah. So the slave markets have been around. The Hammurabi Code has very telling articles regulating the treatment of enslaved people. For instance, look at this, and if you as a master, this is almost 4,000 years ago. If you as a master, a lot more than that. If you as a master have a child with a woman who is your slave, the code says that should you die, the official wife will not inherit her nor her children. Yeah? Why is that? Very simple. The legal minds know that the official wife is not going to have much compassion for that woman, the other woman, right? And for those other children. So the code protects those children and that and the enslaved woman from the woman who inherits the man's estate. Yeah, that I think is telling, and there's much. There are articles that establish what to do in marriages formed between a free woman and an enslaved man, or vice versa, because such a thing was possible. Yeah, it was not weird. And so the code goes into these intricate legal things, like if they have made wealth, produced wealth together, that's going to be divided in one way. If she brought wealth and he brought wealth, whatever he brought, if he's enslaved, that goes to his master. Whereas and so it's complicated. But what I like to illustrate this briefly is that the humanity of a person was not doubted simply because he or she was in bondage. It was seen as just having bad luck. In my view. And I think that is important. Because too often we see, so my students, when I teach them, when I'm doing, I sing the body electric, where there's this man standing on the black, what's that called? Yeah. The poet, what the poet does, the lyrical voice, the poetic voice, is to impersonate the auctioneer. He impersonates the auctioneer, he says, because the sloven who's doing the job does not half know his business, because he does not know the value of the human body, and then insists on how that human body is valuable and is the same, whatever its color, and so on and so forth, and everything. Yeah, and so, but my students, I think I'm gonna shock them with this good tidings. Look at this representation, but they cannot find. They're not elated because they do not find a statement where he explicitly makes a statement against slavery. Yeah? Because the two have become so intertwined and so intricately connected that you assume that they are naturally connected. Yeah? And they're not. The Hammurabi Code would allow for people to marry, one free, one unfree, but the property would be treated accordingly if the separation of goods and wealth was necessary. Yeah? Well, I find that if you confront them with the historical record, I think that we need to arm ourselves with the archive, with the resources that the archive offers us. Yeah? I think it is something illuminating to know that what's his name that I mentioned before, the lieutenant of Juan Ponce de Leon, Juan Garrido, right? And I think it's illuminating for them to know, to come to an understanding that Juan Ponce de Leon could have this armed and strong, skilled fighter, armed to the teeth, riding right behind him. Yeah? If in a southern plantation, people went to your hut, your slave hut, and found one fork, yeah? Found a fork that was cause for uproar throughout the plantation and neighboring plantations, because obviously they were planning to kill all of us, and this is evidence of that. Yeah, and Juan Garrido and then Ponce de Leon riding, all the man had to do was to go like this, yeah, and that would be the end of it. But no, because that was not the deal. The man had accepted that life wasn't too great on him. It did not put him in the position that it put Ponce de Leon. And maybe this, for him, right now, is a good job. And that maybe Ponce de Leon is not a nasty master. Yeah? And so if we're able to recover a memory, I think recovering the memory, I think is a way to go. And recovering it with things that are tangible. So that we don't allow them to sort of language in things like, well, everybody's racist. People have always been racist. People will always be racist, or that racism is anything. If I say something against somebody who is of a different phenotype as me, that right now is racist. Yeah. Whether or not my insult or whatever I am connecting to your ancestry. The fact that one person of one ethnicity or race is saying it against another automatically becomes racist. So it's like racism has become this thing that everyone feels they can define. But no, this is a subject of bloody study. Yeah? And it has to be recovered as that. Yeah? The only time when you can see, and it's something difficult to know. It is difficult to know. So, how do you explain the racism of the Dominican oligarchy against Haitians? Yeah? How do you explain that? Many of them are pretty much similar in terms of phenotype to their, to the people whom they despise. And at the same time, many of them hire them for their own construction works, even as they badmouth the continued growth of the immigrant population. You know? So it's like this is a very ambiguous thing. We need to recognize that that racism is something that one can learn about, that one can study. But as with any subject that is serious and that we want to learn, that it needs to work, and that you don't know it better simply because you come from a history, in which your ancestors have been racially oppressed. You don't automatically know it better. In fact, in the hemisphere, I would argue, in another piece that just is about to come out, in the encyclopedia that Laura Lomas and John Gonzalez published, the Cambridge History of Latino Literature, I contend there, and I feel very confident about this, that in our hemisphere, we are racist by default. Yeah, we delink from racist instinct, from racist assumptions, and so on and so forth. And it usually takes some learning. Yeah, I mean, why would it not be? How was the colonies created? The colonial regime created these levels of humanity. Right? Peoples ranked according to value. Yeah, and when national governments emerged with independence, not one single country said to itself, "Well, okay, we are no longer colonies of Mother Spain. We are new countries. Let us now create a different, contract, social contract. Yeah, we are now going to inherit we're not going to continue the dehumanization and humiliation of people of African ancestry, people of indigenous ancestry, people of Chinese ancestry. Yeah, we are going to treat everybody as equal citizens." Not one single bloody country did that. You know why? Because they were the children. Most of them were the children of the descendants of the people who had perpetrated the conquest and colonization to begin with. Nothing had happened. Nothing had happened to bring them to delink themselves ideologically from the regime that they, that had brought them, that had socialized them. It must have been a very bad talk. If only two questions. If only two questions came.
I found the talk really compelling, and I found myself thinking back to something I read a very long time ago, which is Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. And what you were saying about slavery and not slavery, but racism and the need to justify it through piety made me think of Nietzsche's account of the shift from a system of morals in which things were either good or bad, and bad was bad luck, and good was being king, essentially, to, with the coming of Christianity, this notion of good and evil, right? Which very much aligns with what we were just discussing about piety and then everything else needing to be cast into this sort of realm of metaphysical evil, right? And so I was thinking that that's actually very similar, I think, in some ways to the operation that you're describing.
But as you, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, but what happened with the 1,500 years between that shift? Of course, Christianity took a while to become the dominant religion. What is it about the magnitude? Is it the magnitude of the greed and the conquest and the opportunity for wealth that leads to that?
I think it is the magnitude of the opportunity for wealth, right, that makes it difficult for you to remain loyal to the religious values, right, in terms of how to treat the other children of God. Yeah, but I would not, as Nietzsche, commit myself to something that starts with the origin of Christianity, with the beginning of Christianity, because I'm not. I don't work like that. If you read St. Augustine, St. Augustine will tell you how his mother Monica inherited received her moral and ethical values from that decrepit old woman who was still with the family as a slave, yeah, and who had raised her. And so the slave was still a person for St. Augustine. The slave had been a human person for St. Paul, which is why he says in various parts. He says to the slave, to the master, to the slave, be obedient, work hard, and do it with honesty, and so on and so forth, not with hypocrisy. And then he moves on and says to the master, and you, treat them with respect and treat them well, because just as he has a master, meaning you, yeah, you too have a master. And in his eyes, there's no difference between the two of you. That is Christian, at least at that moment, right? And it continues to be Christian in the centuries that follow. So I would not. For me, it's not the birth of the religion, because basically is what happens to the practice. But that's what we need to if it is possible to historicize something, it would have to be the practice. What happens to the practice when given certain historical circumstances, certain conjunctures? Yeah? And that's why I think that the conquest and colonization is so crucial, because Columbus has been very kind. He's been very sincere when he describes these people as the most lovely and so on and so forth. Yeah, the sweetest people on earth. He thinks he's saying something good that the monarchs are going to be happy to hear, because these are going to be new. But that soon cannot be kept. Very soon thereafter, because then once the production begins, it's not enough to inherit wealth and to inherit and to receive this bounty of labor power for free. You also need to connect the two, and you cannot do that simply by saying, "Would you please do the work? Stop supporting your family and stop taking care of your business and your children. We need you for 18 hours here." Yeah? That needs to be done by force, and so the violence of the economy is going to require violence, and it's going to require. In the French arena, the documents from the 18th century are very clear. There are several documents which show, with a transparency that is shocking, yeah, show that they did not really think that the enslaved blacks were inferior. So what they're advising to their people on the ground, the administrators are advising to the people on the ground how to make them feel less. Yeah? And they go through a detailed thing. For instance, the prohibition of education. You know that the French Revolution committed to universal education, right? But then there's thing, what's going to happen on the colonies? And you have to find a way. You cannot extend that education to them. You have to come up with all kinds of things, because if they learn as much as we do, then what's going to be the difference? How are we going to be able to keep them underfoot? So there's that. So I would argue my short answer to you is I would not go to those moments of founding of a religion. Yeah? Could I allow this gentleman quickly to say his?
I was going to ask about the figure of the Afropolitan in all of this, and I do like the way you framed the discussion in terms of the production of the discursive production of raciality and blackness and the figure of the African. And I wonder if in the current temporality we're in, how the figure of the Afropolitan also being produced and constructed by Africans at home and diaspora. Is this a form of subversion that's racial discourse you go into?
I think that the Afropolitan, for me, the Afropolitan is going to be, I would say about the Afropolitan, the same I would say about Afro-Latinos. There's this new subsection of the Latino population, right? That is sort of highlighting their different conditions, as it were, through that African ancestry and the consequences thereof. For me, the Afropolitan has to demonstrate that it's going to repair some of the damage done by the colonial transaction. And if it's just to show that we can be as hip as a Parisian, as a Londoner, that we have the same. I mean, we're not supposed to be trying to demonstrate that we are as smart or that we are as cool. Well, what I think we need to do is see if there is something that can be done to make sure that the assumptions, right, about the African person and of Africa, even to the point of Africa being a large continent with adjacent islands, not a country, even stuff like that. I mean, we need to revive the knowledge of the human experience of Africa. Theodore Bent in 1893, an archaeologist, went to Great Zimbabwe and sort of came upon this amazing architectural structure, in Mashonaland. As soon as he found them, and he was captivated by the ingenuity of the art and the science that were involved in the production. The first thing he does is to begin to look for evidence of that race that must have created these structures. And he very clearly says it, because obviously, this is not something that was created by any of these Negro races. Now, he had not done any study of the intelligence of the ancestors of these Negro races, but it was just a knowledge that was there that did not need a confirmation. And that is how racism works. Yeah? Which is why I like Darrell Davis. Because the fact is that how can you hate me if you don't know me? The fact is that the person will not have an answer. And will have to, and if the person is at least a polite human being, will have to sit down and have a conversation. Yeah? So that's why I will leave it.
So thank you very much. Remember that we have our reception in the cancer gallery. Please join us right after this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.